June 7, 1944. Normandy, France. The beaches have been taken, and a British logistics officer standing on the sand at Gold Beach is writing in his field notebook something that will eventually find its way into the most honest military assessment the British Army produces of the entire Normandy operation, that what he is watching is not primarily a military operation, it is an industrial one. The officer is watching the beaches from the perspective of a man whose professional specialty is the movement of material, the science of calculating what a military force requires to fight, how much of it needs to arrive at what rate, through what physical infrastructure, and whether the physical infrastructure that the operation has built is adequate to the operational demands that the campaign will place on it. His questions are not about what happened yesterday, which is the question that operational assessments ask about battles. His questions are about what will happen tomorrow and the day after, about whether the rate of material delivery that this beach can achieve is the rate that the army currently consolidating itself on French soil can sustain its operational pace with, or whether the gap between what the army needs and what the beach can deliver will produce, in the days or weeks ahead, the specific and decisive stall that has defeated every previous attempt to establish a substantial Allied lodgment on the European continent. These are not the questions that history books ask about D-Day. History books ask about the men on the beaches, the 27,000 casualties of June 6th, the landing craft grinding onto the sand, the soldiers who died in the water, and the soldiers who survived the water, and the wire, and the machine gun fire, and who took the bluffs above Omaha, and the exits at Utah, and the villages along the British and Canadian beaches. These are the questions that matter most to the men who fought the battle, and they are the questions that deserve the answers that the subsequent decades of historical scholarship have produced with increasing precision and human depth. But the logistics officer watching the beaches on June 7 is asking different questions. He is asking, how many tons of cargo have been discharged in the first 24 hours? At what rate are the LSTs turning around? What is the current status of the causeways and the beach exits? How many vehicles have been offloaded, and how many are waiting? And the answers to these questions, assembled across the days and weeks of the Normandy beachhead's establishment, and compiled in the operational analyses that British planners and American planners produce in the months and years that follow, constitute a different kind of historical account of D-Day, one that the British official military history eventually identifies as the account that most accurately describes why Overlord succeeded where every previous Allied attempt to establish a lodgment on the European continent had failed. The answer is not courage. Courage was universal. The answer is not planning, though the planning was extraordinary. The answer is logistics, specifically American logistics, applied at a scale and with an organizational sophistication that the British military assessment of the Normandy campaign describes, with the professional honesty of an institution evaluating its own allies' contribution to a shared achievement as the decisive enabling factor of the operation. To understand why the British military analysis of D-Day eventually focused so consistently on American logistics, you have to understand what the logistical challenge of Normandy actually was, in the specific and quantitative terms that military planning requires. The challenge is not primarily getting the first wave ashore. The landing itself, however costly in casualties and however demanding in naval and air planning, is a problem of hours. The challenge that defines whether any amphibious operation succeeds or fails beyond the first wave is the sustainment problem. How do you feed an army of 156,000 men, growing to 1 million men, across a beach that has no harbour, no port infrastructure, no road network built to military transport standards, and no supply depot closer than the ports of southern England, across 20 to 30 miles of English Channel, in weather that the June calendar makes unreliable, and that the July and August calendar makes only marginally more so? The specific arithmetic of this problem is documented in the planning documents that Allied headquarters produced through the 18 months preceding the operation, and that the subsequent analyses of the actual achievement compare against the projections. And the arithmetic is specific enough to be illustrative. An army of the size that Overlord requires demands, at minimum, approximately 20,000 tons of supplies per day by the end of the first month of operations. This figure can be broken down into its specific components: food for 156,000, rising to 1 million men, approximately 3,000 tons per day, for a force of that size; ammunition, approximately 8,000 to 10,000 tons per day, for an army in continuous offensive operations against a determined German defense. Fuel for the mechanized army whose advance the operation requires, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 tons per day, as the Army's motor transport and armoured vehicles move inland from the beaches. Medical supplies, signal equipment, engineering materials, spare parts for the vehicles, and the weapons that combat breaks at rates that peacetime maintenance cycles do not anticipate. These numbers are not abstractions. They represent the physical minimum below which the Army stops fighting effectively, below which the ammunition runs out, the vehicles stop for want of fuel, the casualties exceed the medical organization's ability to treat them, and the advance that is the operational purpose of the entire enterprise halts. The logistics officer watching the beaches on June 7th is watching to see whether the number that the operation needs is going to be the number that the beach organization can actually deliver. Not on the first day, when the chaos of the assault landing is still resolving itself into the organized congestion of a military beachhead, but on the 5th day, and the 10th day, and the 30th day, when the accumulation of successful and failed delivery systems has produced the actual throughput rate that the campaign will be constrained to operate within. He is watching, essentially, to see whether the most ambitious logistical operation in the history of military campaigning is going to work at the rate the campaign requires. The answer he is watching for will determine whether the liberation of Europe proceeds or stalls. It is the most important question that a logistics officer has ever been asked to observe and report on, and the notebook in which he is recording his observations will eventually contribute, in the specific and careful way that staff work contributes to institutional knowledge, to the British military's most honest assessment of what decided the campaign. 20,000 tons per day across an open beach, in an operational theatre that has no fixed port infrastructure, and that the German defenders, retreating from the beachhead, will destroy the fixed port infrastructure of at the first opportunity. This is the number that defines whether the operation can sustain itself past the first days, and it is the number that the American Logistics Organization has been building toward since 1942, through the specific combination of engineering innovation, industrial production, and organizational planning that the British military assessment consistently identifies as the American contribution that made the difference between an operation that survived its initial landing and one that could have been driven back into the sea within weeks. The Mulberry Harbour program is the most visible and most discussed element of the American logistics achievement at Normandy, and it is also, in the specific British military analysis, somewhat misrepresented by its visibility. The Mulberry is discussed as a wonder of engineering ingenuity, rather than as the product of a specific and sustained industrial and organizational effort that the American logistical establishment brought to a problem that British planning had identified and that American resources had solved. The concept of the artificial harbour, the prefabricated port that could be towed across the channel and assembled on the French coast to provide the port infrastructure that no French port could provide in the first weeks of the operation, had been discussed in British military planning since the Dieppe raid's lessons were absorbed in late 1942 and early 1943. Churchill himself had been a proponent of the concept since at least 1917, when as First Lord of the Admiralty, he had written a note about floating piers for landing forces on enemy beaches that his wartime memoranda resurrect in the specific context of planning for the large-scale return to the continent. The specific engineering concepts that the Mulberry program eventually implements, the concrete caissons that form the breakwater, called phoenixes in the planning documents, massive structures that British engineers design, and that British construction workers build in dockyards across the south of England, the Lobnitz pierheads that float with the tide, maintaining a consistent height relative to the ships being unloaded, regardless of the 15-foot tidal range that the Normandy coast experiences, the flexible steel mesh roadways called whales that connect the floating piers to the beach, bending with the swell, while maintaining a surface adequate for the military vehicles whose weight and whose continuous traffic the roadways must sustain, were developed by British engineers working within the Combined Operations Headquarters under Mountbatten and his successor, in the specific institutional environment that the commando and amphibious planning work of 1942 and 1943 had created. What American logistics contributed to the Mulberry program was not the concept, but the scale, the specific industrial capacity to produce the 2,500,000 tons of concrete caissons, the phoenixes, as the planning documents named them, massive concrete boxes, up to 200 feet long, that are towed across the channel and then flooded in sequence to form the breakwater wall against which the weather and the sea are managed rather than avoided, and the steel components and the floating pier sections and the connecting roadways that the two Mulberry harbours require, on the timeline that the Overlord planning schedule demands, from an industrial base that had been simultaneously producing Liberty ships and tanks and aircraft, and LSTs and artillery, and every other component of the most complex military operation in history. The organizational challenge of producing Mulberry's components on this timeline, while simultaneously meeting every other production demand of the Overlord operation, is described in the American official logistics history as one of the greatest management achievements of the war, and the British War Office analysis that draws on it agrees. The Mulberry harbours were built at a pace that required the simultaneous coordination of steel fabrication plants, concrete plants, shipyards, and engineering workshops across the British Isles and the eastern United States, organized by a logistics management system whose capacity for that level of simultaneous coordination exceeded anything that either nation's pre-war industrial organization had been required to produce. The British War Office analysis of the Mulberry program, produced in the months following the Normandy campaign, identifies American industrial capacity as the specific enabling factor without which the Mulberry concept, however sound in engineering principle, could not have been executed at the scale and on the timeline that the operation required. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. 0630 hours. The first wave of the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division is in the water and is being destroyed. The specific facts of Omaha Beach in the first hour are the most visceral documentation available of what amphibious assault against a prepared enemy costs in human terms. The landing craft that ramp down too far from the beach, the men who step into 6 feet of water, weighted with equipment and drown before they can fight, the machine gun fire from the bluffs above WN-62 and WN-65 and WN-66 that sweeps the beach with a thoroughness that makes survival on Omaha's 7,000 yards of sand a function of specific local geography rather than any systematic tactical calculation. The rangers who climb the cliffs at Point du Hoc and find the guns have already been moved. What is happening in the water and on the sand in those first hours has almost nothing to do with logistics. It is about individual courage and collective catastrophe. The men in the water cannot think about supply rates and throughput capacity. They can think about keeping their weapon above water, about whether the man ahead of them is still moving or has stopped for a reason that means he will not move again, about the distance between them and the first cover they can see, and whether they can cover that distance without dying. What happens in the days and weeks after the catastrophe is survived? After Cota pushes the surviving men off the beach with the specific authority of a general who understands that staying on the beach means dying on the beach. After Colonel Taylor tells the men of the 1st Division that there are 2 kinds of men on this beach and the dead ones are the other kind, after the bluffs are taken and the beach exits are opened, and the organized German defense above the beach has been broken at the cost that Omaha will cost, is entirely about logistics, about whether what the men who survived the beach have gained can be exploited, and exploitation is a function of supply, and supply is a function of organization, and the organization that American logistics has built for this operation is either going to work at the rate the campaign requires, or it is going to fail at the rate that the history of previous amphibious operations that have stalled for want of supply demonstrates is catastrophic. Specifically about the rate at which the men who have survived the beach can be reinforced and sustained, and the rate at which the vehicles and the ammunition and the food and the fuel and the medical supplies that a fighting army requires can be moved across the beach in quantities and at speeds that the German counterattack, when it comes, cannot drive back into the sea. The beach exits at Omaha are opened on June 6 largely through the initiative of General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, a brigadier general who has landed on the beach and has found the beach in conditions that no planning document has adequately prepared him for, and that his response to will eventually earn him a Distinguished Service Cross for what his citation describes as conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, and Colonel George Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Infantry Regiment, who organizes the surviving men of his regiment who have reached the shelter of the shingle bank above the waterline, and tells them, in the specific and direct language that the moment requires, that there are two kinds of men on this beach: the dead, and those who are going to die if they stay there. The exits that Cotter and Taylor open, the draws through the bluffs that allow vehicles and men to move inland from the beach, are opened by the specific human decisions of officers who decide that the alternative to movement is annihilation. What the American Corps of Engineers does with those exits in the hours and days that follow is a different kind of story. What the American Corps of Engineers does with those exits in the hours and days that follow is a different kind of story. The story of the men with bulldozers and graders and the specific tools of combat engineering who widen the exits, improve the road surfaces, install the traffic control points, and build the beach infrastructure that will allow 20,000 tons of supply per day to flow through a 7-mile stretch of Norman coastline that on the morning of June 6 was nothing but sand and bodies and wreckage. The near failure in the American logistics operation, the moment that comes closest to making the British military assessment of American logistics wrong, arrives with the Great Storm of June 19–22, 1944, the worst channel weather in June in 40 years. The American Mulberry Harbour at Omaha Beach, Mulberry A, the American installation, while its British counterpart at Arromanches is designated Mulberry B, is destroyed by the storm in 72 hours. The concrete caissons that form the breakwater are damaged beyond repair in 72 hours of seas that the engineering specifications did not project as the operational planning requirement for a June installation in the channel. The British Mulberry at Arromanches, Mulberry B, survives with significant damage because its site on the Gold Beach coast has marginally better shelter from the direction of the storm's wave action, and because British engineers make real-time decisions about component arrangement that give the structure slightly more resilience. The specific consequence of Mulberry A's destruction is that the American logistics operation loses, at the moment when the Normandy beachhead is still not fully consolidated, and when the German army has not yet committed its armoured reserves to the counterattack that the Allied command has been anticipating, the most important single piece of its beach infrastructure. The American response to this loss is documented in the War Department's official logistics history, and in the British military assessment that draws on it, documented with the precision of after-action analysis that has access to the specific throughput figures, the specific tonnage moved per day by each method, the specific engineering decisions that the Corps of Engineers and the Transportation Corps made in the hours and days after the storm cleared, and the specific outcome that those decisions produced. Rather than accepting the loss of throughput capacity that Mulberry A's destruction represents as a permanent operational constraint, rather than going to the Joint Chiefs with a request for reduced operational tempo while alternative port facilities are developed at Cherbourg, whose capture on June 26 has provided a French port but not yet a functioning port, because the German garrison has systematically destroyed the port facilities before surrendering the city in the specific expectation that denying the Allies a working port would stall the campaign's supply momentum, the American Corps of Engineers and the American Transportation Corps organizes within 72 hours of the storm's end the most intensive beach supply operation in the history of military logistics. The beach that Mulberry A was supposed to complement is going to do the Mulberry's job without the Mulberry, and the American beach organization that has been running in parallel with the Mulberry since D-Day is going to demonstrate, in the weeks after the storm, that American industrial production and American organizational capacity have built into the beach supply system a resilience that the loss of the Mulberry does not eliminate. LSTs, landing ship tanks, the flat-bottomed, shallow-draft vessels whose specific design allows them to beach themselves directly on the sand, with their bow ramps lowered and their cargo driven off without any pier or port infrastructure, run directly onto the beach and are offloaded by bulldozers while they sit on the sand, their crews sleeping in shifts aboard the vessels, and their cargo moving continuously from the holds onto the beach as long as the tide and the sea state allow. DUKWs, the amphibious vehicles that the American Logistics Organization has been producing at a rate that the British logistics system finds remarkable, 2.5-ton trucks built on a waterproof hull, with a propeller drive that allows them to operate in the water between ships and beach and then drive on the beach roads to the supply dumps without any transfer of cargo between vehicle types, operate continuously between the ships offshore and the beachhead, their route from ship to dump and back becoming in the days after the storm as established, and as trafficked as any road in England. American engineers have laid Sommerfeld tracking, prefabricated steel mesh that can be unrolled on soft sand or mud and provide an immediate hard surface for vehicle traffic, across the beach exits at a rate that the traffic volumes reaching the exits require, and the specific traffic management organization that the First Army's Transportation Corps has deployed on the beaches is processing vehicles through the beach exits at rates that the pre-storm plan had projected for the Mulberry. The throughput rate that the American Beach Organization achieves in the weeks following the Mulberry's destruction exceeds, in absolute tonnage per day, the throughput that the Mulberry had been projected to achieve. The throughput rate that the American Beach Organization achieves in the weeks following the Mulberry's destruction exceeds, in absolute tonnage per day, the throughput that the Mulberry had been projected to achieve, a result that the British military analysis describes, with the specific professional admiration of a logistics organization evaluating another's improvisation under crisis conditions, as the most impressive single logistical achievement of the Normandy campaign. The Pluto system, pipeline under the ocean, represents the most technically innovative element of the American logistics contribution to the Normandy campaign, and the one that the British military analysis addresses with the most explicit acknowledgement of American primacy. The specific problem that Pluto addresses is the fuel problem. The mechanized armies fighting the European campaign consume millions of gallons of petroleum products per week, and moving that petroleum across the channel in conventional tanker vessels through a maritime delivery system subject to U-boat attack and weather disruption represents a vulnerability in the Allied supply chain that the German military has been attempting to exploit since the campaign began. The Pluto concept, a flexible pipeline laid on the ocean floor of the channel to pump fuel directly from pumping stations in England to fuel distribution points in France, had been developed in British engineering planning, but required American industrial capacity and organizational expertise to implement at the scale the campaign required. The first Pluto pipeline under the channel from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, the Hamel flexible steel pipe, specifically designed for ocean floor installation, and produced by engineering teams drawing on the specific industrial manufacturing capability that the American oil and gas pipeline industry has been developing since the 1920s, laid from a converted cable ship that unspools the pipe from drums at a rate that allows it to be installed in a matter of days rather than the weeks that a conventional engineering approach would require, begins pumping in August 1944, supplemented by additional lines as the campaign advances toward the Rhine. By the end of 1944, Pluto is delivering approximately 3,000 tons of fuel per day to the Allied armies in France, fuel that would otherwise require 1,500 tanker truck deliveries per day from the Channel ports, truck deliveries that would consume a proportion of the road network capacity on which the advance itself depends, and whose vulnerability to air attack and mechanical failure at any point in the chain would create a fragility in the fuel supply that Pluto's direct pumping eliminates. The British military analysis of Pluto identifies it as the specific element of the American logistics achievement that most clearly demonstrates the principle that the entire assessment consistently returns to, that the difference between an operation that can sustain itself through the German counterattack and one that stalls for want of fuel is not primarily a function of tactical planning, but of the specific organizational and industrial investment that the logistics system has made in the months and years preceding the operation. The British military analysis of Pluto identifies it as the specific element of the American logistics achievement that most clearly demonstrates the principle that the entire British assessment of D-Day logistics consistently returns to, that the difference between an operation that can sustain itself through the entire German counterattack and one that stalls for want of fuel or ammunition or food is not primarily a function of tactical planning or individual military skill, but of the specific organizational and industrial investment that the logistics system has made in the months and years preceding the operation. By the end of the Normandy campaign in late August 1944, when the German army has been broken out of its defensive line by Operation Cobra and is retreating across France at a pace that the Allied pursuit can barely sustain, the specific logistical achievement of the first 70 days of the Normandy beachhead can be measured in the numbers that the Allied logistics organizations have compiled and that the British military analysis will examine and assess in the months that follow. American forces have unloaded approximately 929,000 men 586,000 tons of supplies, and 177,000 vehicles across the Normandy beaches and through the Mulberry Harbour and its replacement beach facilities in the first 30 days of the operation, numbers that the pre-operation planning had projected as the target and that the actual achievement has met and in several categories exceeded, despite the loss of Mulberry A and the 3 days of the Great Storm that interrupted all beach supply operation. The British and Canadian logistics organisations have achieved comparable proportional results in their own beach sectors, where Mulberry B's survival has provided a functioning artificial harbour infrastructure for the duration of the campaign. The British and Canadian logistics organisations have achieved comparable proportional results in their own beach sectors. Together, the Allied supply system has sustained in the field an army of more than 1 million men, the threshold that the pre-operation planning identified as the minimum necessary for the German defensive line to be broken, and has done so through a beach supply system rather than the fixed port infrastructure that conventional military logistics doctrine prescribed as necessary for operations at this scale. The British military assessment of this achievement, the assessment that identifies it as the decisive factor of the Normandy campaign, rather than any specific tactical engagement or operational decision, is not written as an appreciation of American logistics prowess. It is written as a professional military analysis of why the operation succeeded, where the analytical framework that British military planning had developed over decades of experience said it should have been vulnerable. The analysis finds that the vulnerability was real, that an army of this size, sustained across open beaches without adequate port infrastructure, in the specific weather conditions of the English Channel in summer, against a German army whose operational response included the systematic destruction of French port infrastructure, should, by the standards of previous military logistics experience, have been unable to sustain itself at the rates the campaign required. The analysis finds that the vulnerability did not produce failure. It finds that the specific logistical innovation and organizational investment that American logistics had brought to the problem, the Mulberry Harbour, the Pluto pipeline, the Ducablu fleet, the LST beach unloading capability, the Corps of Engineers beach organization, the Transportation Corps throughput management, had addressed each specific element of the vulnerability with a solution adequate to the demand. And it finds, in the specific professional language of military analysis, rather than the elevated rhetoric of public commemoration, that this achievement was the most important thing that happened at Normandy. The soldiers on the beaches did not know about most of this. They knew the water and the sand and the fire, and the men beside them, and the bluff in front of them, and whether the man on their left was still alive. The logistics of what sustained them after they reached the top of the bluff was invisible to them, in the specific way that logistics is invisible to fighting soldiers, visible only in its absence, when the ammunition runs out, or the rations don't arrive, or the vehicles stop because there is no fuel, and transparent when it works as it did at Normandy, the supply chain operating at the rate the campaign demanded, without becoming the constraint that the campaign's planners had identified as its most serious strategic vulnerability. The British military assessment of D-Day, that focuses on American logistics, is not an account of men and machines and combat. It is an account of the organizational architecture that allowed men and machines and combat to produce the result they produced, the liberation of a continent from an occupation whose end required not merely the courage of the men who fought on the beaches, but the specific industrial and organizational capacity of the nation that supplied them. It is also, in the specific professional context of a British military institution, evaluating an Allied military organization's contribution to a shared achievement, a specific and documented acknowledgement that the American contribution was larger and more enabling than the public narrative of D-Day, which focuses on the beaches and the men and the individual acts of extraordinary courage that the beaches produced, has consistently captured. The British military assessment is more comfortable than most public narratives, with the specific proposition that logistics decides wars in the sense that matters most to the outcome, because the British Army has the institutional memory of 2 world wars in which the logistical failures of Allied supply, the Gallipoli campaign, the early Western Front supply crises, the Dunkirk evacuation's equipment losses, have been more decisive than any tactical failure in determining the campaign's constraints and the campaign's outcomes. It approaches the Normandy campaign with this institutional memory and asks, what is the equivalent logistical innovation here, the specific enabling achievement that prevents the logistical failure that has defeated comparable operations before? The answer it finds is American. It finds it in the Mulberry Harbour and the Pluto Pipeline and the Duquovu Fleet and the LST Beach Organization and the Corps of Engineers Beach Management and the Transportation Corps Throughput System. It finds it in the specific and demonstrable achievement of 20,000 tons per day across an open beach, sustained through the worst channel storm in 40 June years, at a rate that the German army's counterattack could not reduce below the operational minimum that the campaign required. This is what the British Army's honest professional analysis found when it looked at D-Day. This is what it said. The American logistics organization that built and operated the Normandy supply system is not remembered in the way that the soldiers who climbed Pointe du Hoc are remembered, or in the way that the paratroopers who dropped into the dark behind Utah Beach are remembered. But the British military's honest professional assessment of what decided the Normandy campaign asks us to remember them too. To understand that the capacity to sustain 1 million men in the field, across an open beach, in the worst storm in 40 years, is not a lesser achievement than the courage of the men it sustained, and that the most honest account of why Overlord succeeded is the account that includes both.